All right, I want to welcome everyone to this month's Morris Bart Lecture Series. We are very fortunate to have David Kunian here, and I think most people, do you pronounce it Kunian or Kunian?
Kunian, like a Q.
Kunian, he is a familiar face around town. David completed his master's degree in musicology from Tulane University in 2013. He's produced radio for more than 20 years and produced 10 documentaries about New Orleans artists. He also has had a weekly show on WWOZ since 1993. He's been awarded grants from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities and the Louisiana Division of the Arts, the Decentralized Arts Program, and the Hennessy Foundation. He currently serves as curator of the New Orleans Jazz Museum at the Mint. Thank you for coming. We're very excited to have you here today.
I'm happy to be here and glad to be, talking to y'all and stuff. First of all, can everyone see the screen and see the PowerPoint and stuff? Everything's cool with that? Okay, then let me get started, I guess. Again, I'm David Kunian. I came up with this talk a few years ago just because I had been reading up on Louis Armstrong and wanted to just put together something about, what he saw and where he lived and stuff like that, and compare it to what it looks like now, which, as you will see, is kind of depressing in a certain way. So let me just kind of get started. Okay. What you're looking at is a picture of 723 Jane Alley, which is where Louis Armstrong was born in 1950. This is the 1956 photo. Armstrong was born here either on August 1st, 1901 or July 4th, 1900. It's a kind of controversy. Armstrong always said he was born on July 4th, 1900. But a researcher in the early 2000s by the name of Tad Jones, one day literally just wanted to figure out whether this was true or not, and he wandered into the church where Armstrong said he had been baptized. He literally went to the office and looked up, and said, "Do you have this baptismal certificate?" And they said, "Sure, here it is." And the baptismal certificate said that Armstrong's official date of birth was August 1st, 1901. So in the small jazz world that I live in, this was a huge controversy. So, some people say one, some people say the other. Anyway, the block he was born on is Jane Alley, running between Perdido and Gravier Street. It was narrow and unpaved. In his great book, his autobiography, Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, he described where he lived as, quote, lying in the very heart of what is called the battlefield, because the toughest characters in town used to live there and would shoot and fight so much. In that one block between Gravier and Perdido Street, more people were crowded than you ever saw in your life. There were church people and gamblers and hustlers and cheap pimps and thieves and prostitutes and lots of children. There were bars, honky-tonks, and saloons. When he was born, Armstrong lived in this house with his mother, his father, and his grandmother, but apparently they argued a lot, and eventually his mother moved out, and then his father moved out. Armstrong was left with his grandmother, who raised him as best as she could, and for whom Armstrong always had a great amount of love and affection. Let me show you a couple other pictures. This is also Jane Alley. This is Jane Alley, kind of coming from, I think, Perdido Street. Kind of the back of the house where Armstrong was born in 1964. And now you have what it looks like now. Today, 723 Jane Alley is gone. All of Jane Alley, where Armstrong grew up, is gone. In its place is the headquarters of the New Orleans Police Department and the Municipal Court. Currently, to mark the place where Armstrong was born, there's a Jane Alley street sign and a black, this is also, we all know this, Municipal Court. And there is a black marble marker set in the ground between the municipal court fountain and the police memorial for the memorial for officers killed in the line of duty. The marker explains where Armstrong was born, gives the name of his parents, Willie Armstrong and Mary Albert, and states that the house was demolished in 1964. Now, you know, whether Armstrong's house was demolished in the name of, quote, progress and renewal, unquote, as an insensitive and permanent oversight, or kind of, you know, you read some of the newspaper articles and there is a kind of subtext that it was a deliberate kind of insult to a black man and to black culture in the midst of the civil rights movement and the waning of Jim Crow. You can kind of read that as a subtext. So all of these things are working into, you know, why Armstrong's house wasn't preserved. There were attempts to do it, but it just didn't work, and the people who were destroying it, for some reason, had to destroy it really quickly. Currently, there's still a block of Jane Alley, if you ever want to walk down Jane Alley, between Banks and Palmyra Street. It's a kind of isolated block, and it's modest and doesn't really distinguish itself. This is Jane Alley in 2015. From really anything around it. But if you ever go to Chickawawa, it's around the corner from there, and from the bus barn on Canal Street and stuff like that. So it's right near there. All right, let's keep going. Here's another one of kind of what Jane Alley looks like, you know, basically now. I mean, okay, Armstrong Neighborhood, Liberty and Perdido Street, 1949. Armstrong lived on Jane Alley with his grandmother until about 1905, 1906. She took him to church. He would help her when she took in laundry and washing, did the washing for people. He would help her deliver the clothes after they were clean. He played hide and seek and other games with the neighborhood kids. Even though he was living in abject poverty, Armstrong recalls these days with joy. When he was 4 or 5, a friend of his mother's came to get him as his mother had taken ill and needed him to help her and help his baby sister Beatrice, whom Armstrong always referred to as Mama Lucy. He left his grandmother and he took the streetcar with the friend to his mother's. When he got off the streetcar, he remembered looking straight down Liberty Street, which in this photo would kind of be, I think, between the two buildings. He says, crowds of people were moving up and down as far as the eye could see. When Armstrong arrived at his mother's house, which was a single room in the back courtyard, she sent him out on Rampart Street to get a slice of meat, a pound of red beans, and a pound of rice. Very, typical for the age. Armstrong's mother's room was 2 blocks from Rampart Street, the center of what was known as Black Storyville, the slightly more rundown red light district on the uptown side of Canal Street and Storyville. Some of the more kind of famous and notorious establishments where the rudiments of jazz were being worked on nightly on the bandstand stood only a couple blocks from his home. For instance, the famous Funky Butt Hall was up on Liberty and Union, a couple blocks from his house. And later, Armstrong had his first gig ever at a place called Henry Ponce's near Liberty and Perdido, where, as his friend, who was known as Cocaine Buddy, told him, you want to play this gig? All you have to do is put on your long pants and play the blues for the whores that hustle all night. And when you play the blues, they'll call you sweet names and buy you drinks and give you tips. So currently, that is what it looked like then. This is what it looks like now. Again, this is very familiar to everybody. Currently, Liberty and Perdido does not exist. The block of Liberty Street where Armstrong lived with his mother is occupied by the walk-up and the front door to City Hall. There are often crowds of people as far as the eye can see, but they might have different things on their mind. Whether the people who occupy this space are any different from the people who lived there in the opening years of the 20th century, again, is up for debate. This, as you know, is Liberty and Perdido looking the other way toward the African hut in the park. Okay. The Eagle Saloon on Rampart and Perdido Street. This corner, where the former Eagle Saloon still stands, is a spot where Armstrong shot off his gun on New Year's Eve 1913 and was subsequently arrested and sent to the colored Wavestone. Armstrong had been hanging out with his friends, with whom he had a singing quartet, that sang for tips on Rampart Street. He saw another child shoot off a gun, and in response, Armstrong shot off his stepfather's gun that he had gotten out of his mother's drawer. A few minutes later, he shot it off again and was apprehended by a police officer. He went to juvenile court and spent the night in jail, after which he was placed in the colored Wavestone. This actually was the second time that Armstrong was ever mentioned in the newspaper. The New York Times Democrat edition of January 2nd, 1913 has an article about New Year's Eve arrests. And as Thomas Brothers quotes in his great book, Louis Armstrong's New Orleans, quote, the article said, "The most serious case was that of Louis Armstrong, a 12-year-old Negro who discharged a revolver at Rampart and Perdido Streets. Being an old offender, he was sent to the Negro Wavestone." I think he had been arrested before for possibly stealing something out of an abandoned building or a pile of rubble. I can't quite remember, but he had been mentioned he was a known offender, as they say. The Eagle Saloon still stands on the corner of Rampart and Perdido Street. This is, you can go there today. It actually looks a little bit better than that. This is an old photo. It's got, in the windows, it has photos of the famous people who used to play there, and it looks a bit better than it does now. But it is a part of the historic 400 block of Rampart Street, where some of the few remaining buildings of the origins of jazz still exist. The buildings are in half decent shape. They're doing a little better. The Moreau Foundation of St. Bernard Parish used to own them and now has kind of sold them to people who are doing some kind of work on them, slow but sure. And these buildings are really some of the last ones where you can look and say jazz started here. If you look around it, like much of the neighborhood of, that was Black Storyville, this hopping neighborhood where jazz started and there was all sorts of vice and fun. It is surrounded by parking lots. Okay, so he got committed to the colored Wavestone. This is a postcard of the colored Wavestone in 1913. It was situated on Canal Boulevard between Metairie Cemetery and the Holt Cemetery, which is the Paupers Cemetery. According to Armstrong's biography, it was a place of work and discipline, with children cleaning buildings, developing skills such as music and carpentry, and drilling with wooden rifles. Armstrong was so nervous when he arrived here that depressed that he couldn't eat, which is really saying something for Louis Armstrong, because one thing you know about Louis Armstrong is he certainly did like to eat. He gravitated to the band and its director, Peter Davis. Davis took a long while to like Armstrong because he knew the neighborhood Armstrong came from and thought that only bad boys came from there. But eventually he took to him and he allowed him to start on percussion in the band and then played bugle and then cornet. Armstrong learned European classical music and other hymns and folk music. He also learned how to read and write there. The consensus of thought is that kind of Armstrong's time at the home steered him in the direction of being a musician and not really, and away from kind of being a street ruffian, even though he really never lost his sense of the streets and how to act there and what it was like. So Armstrong was released from the home in the summer of 1914 to his father, with whom he lived with for a short time before moving back into his mother. The gig that I spoke about at Henry Ponce's, where you had to play the blues, as well as his coal delivery job, which we'll talk about in a sec, started after his time in the colored Wavestone. And in 1932, the colored Wavestone combined with the Milne Boys Home, and it moved to the 5400 block of Franklin Avenue in Gentilly. So, here's kind of another picture of the colored Wavestone in 1956. This is what it looks like now. All that remains of the Wavestone is the railroad tracks that went alongside it. There's now a cell phone tower that looms over the New Orleans Fire Department Information Technology Building that you can see right there. And then the Holt Cemetery is very close to there, kind of behind there. The Holt Cemetery is the final resting place for the first man of jazz, Buddy Bolden, Jesse Hill, Mr. Oopoopadoo, and one of the great early 20th century Mardi Gras Indian chiefs, Big Chief Tillman. So next, this is currently the Karnowski Store. I could not find any old pictures of it, but we actually do have a picture of it now. And this was a store where the Karnowski family worked and sold things. It was kind of a dry goods store. Armstrong worked for the Karnowski family when he was 7 and 8 years old. He refers to Morris Karnowski in his autobiography, Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, writing, quote, "The job I took with Morris Karnowski was easier, and I stayed with him a long time. His wagon went through the red light district or Storyville, selling stone coal at a nickel a bucket. Lewis and Morris would drive through Storyville and sell coal to the prostitutes who used it in their fireplaces to heat their cribs, this kind of small, almost closets where they plied their trade. The Karnowskis also took a liking to Lewis and had him over for meals. They kind of became his like second family. They loaned him, $2 toward the purchase of his first instrument, a cornet he saw in the window of a local pawn shop, and they helped him clean it and polish it. Armstrong's affection for the Karnowskis never wavered. When he was the king of Zulu in 1949, he stopped the entire parade in front of the Karnowski store at 427 South Rampart Street to visit with Morris Karnowski, and hung out there for like a half hour while everyone waited for him. The Zulu parade was a little different back then. In addition, in 1969, Armstrong wrote this remarkable essay about the Karnowskis while he was recovering from illness in Beth Israel Hospital in New York. In this essay, he talks about what it was like working for them, and he confesses his admiration for the Karnowskis and for the Jewish people in general. It's a great essay about how he appreciated how Jewish folks stuck together and how they were kind to each other and kind to people and stuff like that. So. And there are also stories in this essay about he and the Karnowski kids selling coal and unloading the junk wagon. And I will say I have a personal kind of connection to this that I didn't realize at the time. When I first moved to town, I was a waiter, and I worked on the corner of Bourbon and St. Peter for a guy who owned a bunch of restaurants up and down Bourbon Street named Nick Karno. And I didn't know this at the time, and if I had, he was kind of a mean guy. I tried to stay away from him, but I know what I'm about to tell you at the time. Nick Karno was Morris Karnowski's grandson. And so I worked for a Karnowski too. So I have that in common with Louis Armstrong. And if I'd known more, I actually would have tried to, if I knew now what I knew then, I would have tried to interview him a little bit and befriend him. But he was a kind of prickly man. Which I suppose you have to be if you're running restaurants on Bourbon Street in the early 90s. Anyway, so this is the Karnowski store. It's been abandoned for a while, but they are starting to, again, do some work on it. And, I'm not quite sure what they're going to do with it. There are all sorts of plans and speculation, but work is being done. So, okay. The battlefield. I referred to the battlefield earlier. This is what it looked like in 1949, Loyola and Poydras. The battlefield sometimes refers to the entire red light district where Armstrong lived, or it can kind of refer to what they called back of town, the swampy neighborhood of Black Storyville that stretches down Poydras. That included the Girard Street Cemetery, which is gone now, and that's the cemetery where the Superdome now stands. And going further toward the lake. It was a swampy part of town. It was rough. Besides being known for its characters and saloons and kind of, gambling dens and such, it was behind where the Superdome is now. It was a gathering spot every year for Mardi Gras Indians, where they would, parade and get into confrontations, sometimes violent. In Thomas Brothers' book about Armstrong's New Orleans, a musician by the name of Eddie Dawson said it was so rough back there that the police were scared to go there. And also, right near the battlefield was something called the Magnolia Bridge over the New Basin Canal, which was there where now the overpass is, where the interstate and the Crescent City connection are. And the Magnolia Bridge, if you listen to Mardi Gras Indian music, gets referenced a lot as a place where people would cross and people would, go across and have confrontations and stand their ground and do the Mardi Gras Indian thing. So, Armstrong talked about the battlefield being also at Miro and Poydras. He said that his father lived in the heart of the battlefield. So now, this is Loyola and Poydras. Very different. It has changed a lot from when it was back then. It's hotel, as you know, it's office buildings, hotels, and sports arenas. It's really, I think of as modern a section of New Orleans as there is. If you go further toward the lake down Poydras, it becomes kind of vacant land and warehouses as it gets toward Armstrong's birthplace. So this is Miro and Poydras looking toward the dome on a kind of cloudy day. And this is looking back toward where Armstrong lived and the municipal court now. So, okay. Armstrong played and went by, I don't think, a lot of places, different clubs and saloons and music establishments back in the early 1900s. One of them was this place called Plalas or Lalas Cabaret on Iberville and Marais. Apparently, it was one of the more happening spots in the district, as Storyville was known. Many of the early jazz players had gigs in this bar. Kid Ory played here, Sweet Emma, Harry Zeno, Freddie Capard, Jimmy Nooney, all played in this building. Armstrong claimed that one of his favorite parts about selling coal from the Karnowski wagon was not only the glimpses he got of the scantily dressed prostitutes, but also, and this is again from Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, he appreciated being able to go into Storyville without being bothered by the cops. And the thing he appreciated most, because generally, unless they were working, African Americans weren't allowed in Storyville, and certainly children of his age were not even close to being allowed in Storyville. But he could go in because he was working, and he appreciated not being bothered by the cops because he could go by, as he said, Plalas Cabaret, where Joe Oliver, King Oliver, had his band and where he was blowing up a store. No one could touch him. So this place was the first place where Armstrong saw King Oliver, who became his mentor, and let him, let Armstrong carry his cornet, and eventually hired him for his best and more favorite jobs. Oliver and his wife treated Armstrong like family. Armstrong wrote in one of his letters simply, "Joe Oliver has always been my inspiration and idol. No trumpet player ever had the fire that Oliver had. Man, he could really punch a number." King Oliver left New Orleans for Chicago in 1918 after Storyville closed. And when he needed a second cornetist to, for it, when he had a gig at the Lincoln Gardens in Chicago, he sent for Armstrong. Armstrong joined him at this place in 1922, and that's the beginning of Armstrong slowly but surely becoming the star that he was. And this gig at the Lincoln Gardens became kind of one of the most celebrated gigs in the history of jazz, roaring 1920s Chicago, and it all kind of starts with Armstrong seeing King Oliver in this place right here. I bet you can't guess what Pete Lala's looks like now. That is Pete Lala's now at Iberville and Marais Street, 2015. Again, parking lots. Another angle of parking lots. All right. Next, we've got Tom Andersons in Storyville. This is at Iberville and Basin Street. Tom Andersons Saloon here had a reputation of being one of the classiest bars in Storyville. It was Basin Street and Iberville Street, and Tom Anderson was the kind of the state rep for that district in Baton Rouge, and he was kind of the unofficial mayor of Storyville. According again to Armstrong's autobiography, Armstrong played here in the 1910s when he wasn't playing on the riverboats. He writes, "It was a swell job if there ever was one. Only the richest racehorse men came to Tom Anderson's. They spent a lot of money, and they gave us a lot of tips to play tunes for them and their chicks. They would order big meals and just kind of mince over them. Since I was a dear friend of the waiters, they gave me a break. When they would pass the bandstand on the way to the chicken with the dead soldiers or the leftovers, they'd look me in the eye and I would give them the well-known wink. During intermission, I would head straight for the kitchen and all the fine food that is waiting for me there. So that was Tom Anderson's in Storyville. Also, apparently, rumor had it that the bar at Tom Anderson's was half a block long, so it was a very long bar. Most of, I'll give you another picture of Tom Anderson's, this is one of the famous pictures of Storyville, kind of looking down Basin Street with the fancy brothels over here and here. Pardon me. Now, most of Storyville, including Plalas Club and Tom Andersons Saloon, was destroyed to make way for the Iberville projects in the 1940s. And Tom Anderson's is now kind of the parking lot for what was Krause's and is now the, an apartment building and parking lot for the apartment building on Basin and Canal. In terms of Storyville, I don't necessarily have pictures of this, but there are still 3 buildings from Storyville up. One of them, 2 of them are one's on the corner of Basin and Bienville Street, kind of across Basin Street from the Sanger. And the other one is on, I want to say, Basin and Murray. That's a grocery store. They're both grocery stores. And then there's another one on Villery and St. Louis that's a warehouse. So anyway, that's kind of, Armstrong's, that's Armstrong's New Orleans then and now. I always kind of bring this up that just as we're sitting around living in New Orleans, to make sure that everyone is aware that some of these buildings, that some of the early jazz buildings are still around, and that some of them are not in great shape, but we should always be very conscious of where they are, and try to preserve them. And I think that's, of course I'm saying that because I'm a music curator and it's valuable to me, but I think it's valuable to the history of the town and the history of jazz in general, to make sure that places like the early jazz clubs in the 7th Ward and Buddy Bolden's house on First Street, don't fall over. So, that is all that is my presentation. Thank you all for, sitting through it. I suppose I'll take some questions, I guess. If anyone has any and I can possibly answer them. I'm sorry?
How long did Louis Armstrong stay in Chicago, and when did he come back to New Orleans?
Armstrong, I think, was in Chicago through the 30s, and then he moved to New York and basically lived in New York, in Harlem, then his wife bought a house in Queens in the 1950s. That's now the Louis Armstrong House and Museum, which is required, everyone should go see. It's a really great spot. He came back to New Orleans several times. He came back in the 30s and toured and went back to the Wavestone and saw, did a little, hung out there for a while. He came back in 1949 when he was King of Zulu. He came back in, I want to say, the 50s at some point. And then by the time the 50s came around, he was running into conflict with the city because his trombonist, Jack Teagarden, was a white man, and the city, because of the Jim Crow laws, wouldn't let a mixed race band play together. And they gave him a lot of trouble with that. And he finally just said, enough in New Orleans. I'm not coming back till this is all over, if I come back at all. And then in 1964, he was in Memphis for a gig, and several members of the jazz club, New Orleans Jazz Club, came up to Memphis and asked him specifically, you need to come back home to New Orleans. It's different now. It's better and stuff. So he finally came back in October of 1965. And the Jazz Museum has, I'm looking right now at boxes and boxes of photos from his visit in 1965 and documents and things like that. So And that was the last time he came back in 1965.
And what places did he play in 1965?
I think he did a gig at the Hotel Sonesta. And he came by the Jazz Museum because one of the things that Jazz Museum has that, of course, you all should come see is we have the cornet that he played in the Wavestone. Not technically his first cornet, but the cornet that he really became a musician on. We have it here, and we have in Baton Rouge, if you're up there at the Capitol Park Museum, in the Capitol grounds, we have his first bugle too. So, but he played, I want to say he played a gig at the Sonesta and maybe someplace bigger. I can't remember where.
Did you say what year the Wavestone closed?
I did. The Wavestone merged with the Milne Boys Home in look, I can see that there again. I want to say in the 60s.
And he was there for about a year?
No, I'm sorry. 1932, the Wavestone combined with the Milne Boys Home and moved to Franklin Avenue in Gentilly. So 1932.
And he lived there for about a year?
Yeah, a little over a year. I want to say 13, 14 months. And as I said, Louis Armstrong, without that, he might have become a musician, but I don't think I think he would have gotten swallowed up by the streets. And I think he probably would not have made it, to become I probably not lucky to make it into his 40s. Something would have happened to him. He would have, some bad end, I think, just from he would have ended up being a street kid and hustling and something would have happened. But the boys' home, the Waves home really put him in a direction where he saw that he enjoyed playing the cornet, and that the cornet could get him out of the situations he was in.
Well, and certainly learning how to read and write as well.
Right. And I mean, one thing people don't realize necessarily, because his singing and his trumpet playing are, so groundbreaking and amazing. He was an amazing writer. He was a really great writer. Anything you read by him, Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, or the collected letters, he's a fantastic writer. He sounds like, he sounds exactly like he does when he talks, and he's got a really, fantastic way of putting things, and very much evokes the places and times he has been. He's a serious artist. And if you we had an exhibit at the Jazz Museum a while back with Prospect, where we got something called his tape collage boxes here. And what he would do is, Louis Armstrong had a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and he recorded everything. He recorded, radio shows, mixtape kind of things, himself talking, being a DJ. And he would take the boxes and he would cut out pictures and tape them and make these kind of collages on these boxes. And I am no expert in collage art by any stretch of the imagination. But the people who I like them, the people who are it's the legitimate, serious art, the way he put this stuff together, and judged that way by art historians and stuff. So, he was a true artist.
David?
Yes.
Is it true that he wore a Star of David the rest of his life?
He did.
I've heard that.
He did. Yeah, he wore, I think, the rest of his life, certainly for a long time in his life. Yeah, he did, to remember how appreciative he was toward the Karnowskis and the Jewish people who helped him out.
Is there any documentation about whether anyone in his family was a musician? His parents or grandparents or anyone?
His mom was not, his sister was not. I think his dad may have played a little, but not much. And beyond that, it's hard. Some people are doing some work on who his grandparents, doing his genealogy, but it's hard stuff to find. I don't think there was any, it goes much back. There were musicians in his family before that. But I could be wrong, and more research is needed to figure that out.
Hi, David. Thank you. This has been wonderful.
You're welcome.
I want to ask you something. My mom was one of the first female disc jockeys in the South in the 50s for WJMR radio.
Okay.
And she had the honor of interviewing Satchmo. And I didn't know if you all had any of the tapes, like things like that. She was actually successful in getting his agent to bring him down to New Orleans and did an extensive interview.
I would have to look. I'm pretty sure we don't have any of that. And I would, if you have copies of that, I would love to have that to add to, the collection and stuff. That would be great.
I don't, unfortunately. I have amazing stories of how they wouldn't only let him in the freight elevator and wouldn't let him drink out of a cup. So she gave her and things like that. But no, thought I'd ask. Thank you.
No, I don't have anything, but I'll keep an eye out for it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions or comments? I feel like I could ask questions all day about this.
Well, I'm happy to come when we can do this in person, do this again with, other topics that people might suggest. I'm always, doing this kind of research is really fun for me. So I really enjoy it. Okay, cool.
Great.
Well, thank you all for coming and listening.
Much.
All right, y'all have a.
I really appreciate it. This was great. And yes, I will definitely have you come back when we're back in person.
Yeah, that would be fun. So, okay, great. Well, y'all have a great day and stay dry. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rachel. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you, Rachel.